The old mill stood at the edge of town, its tall frame casting a long shadow over the river that slowly flowed beside it. The wooden boards were weathered and gray, the roof sagged in places, and the large wheel that once turned with strength was now still, covered in moss and dust. To most people who passed by, it looked like nothing more than a crumbling reminder of a wasted dream. Children would laugh when they walked past it on their way home from school, and adults would shake their heads, whispering that the man who owned it, old Mr. Thomas, had been foolish for holding on to such a place. When Thomas had been alive, he poured all his energy into the mill. He worked from morning until evening, fixing gears, repairing beams, and trying to keep the old machine running. But times had changed. No one needed flour from a small wooden mill when giant factories could produce it faster and cheaper. Neighbors mocked him, saying he was living in the past. "You wasted everything," they would mutter as he walked past in his worn jacket, carrying his toolbox. Yet Thomas never argued. He simply gave them a polite smile and returned to his work, as if he knew something they didn't. His children, 2 sons, Daniel and Michael, and his daughter, Emily, grew up hearing those words whispered about their father. They loved him deeply, but they often wondered why he held on so tightly to something that looked worthless. He would often sit with them on the porch of the old house near the mill, telling them stories about how one day the mill would matter again. He never explained fully, only saying, "Everything we do here has a reason. One day you will see." The children respected his words, but even they sometimes doubted him, especially when other kids made jokes about the crazy man with the broken mill. Years passed and Thomas grew older. His hands became rough and scarred from the countless repairs. His back bent from lifting heavy beams, and yet his determination never faded. To him, the mill was not just a building. It was his life's work, his heart, and his legacy. Then came the day when he quietly left this world, sitting in his favorite chair by the fireplace with a journal in his lap. His children were heartbroken. They buried him near the small garden he had tended for years. And for the first time, the mill was completely silent. After his passing, relatives and neighbors began pressuring the children to sell the property. "It's just a pile of wood," one uncle scoffed. "You could get a little money for the land and start fresh." Others said, "Your father wasted his life, don't waste yours by keeping that old ruin." The children listened but didn't respond. They were torn between practicality and loyalty. To their eyes, the mill was nothing but a decayed building that might collapse any day. But in their hearts, they remembered their father's words, that everything he had done had a reason. Emily, the youngest, often wandered into the mill, brushing dust from the old wooden counters and staring at the wheel that no longer turned. She felt as if the place was whispering secrets she couldn't quite understand. Daniel, the eldest, was more practical. He wanted to sell it to pay off debts and move on. Michael stood somewhere in between, uncertain but unwilling to let go too easily. Together they argued late into the nights, trying to decide what to do. Meanwhile, the townspeople continued to laugh. "Look at them, clinging to their father's mess," a shopkeeper said one afternoon. "They'll learn the hard way that dreams don't pay bills." The words stung, but the children tried not to let them show. Still, doubts grew heavier each day. One evening, as they sat around the old wooden table in their kitchen, Daniel slammed his hand down in frustration. "We can't keep living like this," he said. "The mill is worthless. Everyone knows it." Michael looked at him with hesitation. "But Dad wouldn't have wanted us to just give it away," he replied. Emily, her eyes thoughtful, finally spoke. "Dad always said the mill mattered. He said there was a reason. Don't you think we should at least try to understand what he meant before making a decision?" Her words silenced her brothers. That night, none of them slept easily. The wind outside rattled the shutters, and the creaks of the old house made them restless. But deep inside, a small spark had been lit. Curiosity began to outweigh doubt. For the first time, they wondered if maybe their father had left them more than they realized. The next morning, Emily returned to the mill with a lantern in hand. Dust floated in the air as the sunlight pierced through cracks in the walls. She walked slowly across the wooden floor, her shoes echoing in the emptiness. Her hand brushed against the shelves, and she noticed a small, leather-bound journal lying forgotten in a corner. Opening it, she found pages filled with her father's handwriting, lines of notes, sketches, and strange markings. At the top of one page, in bold letters, were the words, "The true value is not what they see, it lies beneath." She gasped softly, her heart racing. Those were his words. the very ones he had repeated to them so many times. She clutched the book and ran back to the house to show her brothers. They gathered around, turning the pages carefully. There were diagrams of the mill's foundations, lists of items hidden in certain places, and strange codes they couldn't immediately understand. Daniel frowned, unsure if it was just ramblings of an old man. But Michael leaned closer, his eyes shining with curiosity. "What if this is what he meant?" he whispered. Emily nodded eagerly. The three of them sat in silence for a long time, the weight of their father's mysterious words heavy in the room. Slowly, realization began to grow. Perhaps the mill wasn't just a decaying building. Perhaps it was a puzzle waiting to be solved. A message their father had carefully left for them to uncover. And so, while the town continued to laugh and dismiss them as dreamers like their father, the children decided they could not let go just yet. They would search, they would explore, and they would try to find the hidden truth behind the old mill. None of them knew what they would find, but for the first time since their father's death, they felt a spark of hope. The mill, silent and broken on the outside, seemed to be holding its breath, waiting for them to take the first step into its secrets. And though they could not see it yet, the journey ahead would change everything, not just for them, but for the entire town. The next morning, Daniel, Michael, and Emily returned to the mill with the leather journal clutched tightly in Emily's hands. The sun was low, casting golden rays through the broken windows of the mill, making dust dance like tiny stars in the air. The place no longer felt like a ruin to them. It felt alive, as if their father's spirit was guiding them. Still, none of them knew exactly where to begin. They only had his notes, his strange diagrams, and their determination. Daniel lit a lantern and held it high as they stepped deeper into the mill. The floorboards groaned beneath their weight, and the smell of damp wood filled their noses. Michael read aloud from the journal, his voice trembling with both excitement and doubt. "It says here, the beams above hold the mark, the floor conceals the path, and the walls carry the truth. What does that even mean?" Emily leaned closer to look at the sketches. They seemed to show parts of the mill drawn in detail, certain areas circled, arrows pointing toward corners, and notes scribbled beside them. They began their search carefully, running their fingers across the wooden beams. Emily was the first to notice faint carvings etched into the old wood, symbols that didn't make sense at first glance. She traced them with her hand. "Dad made these marks. Look, he wanted us to find them." Michael crouched beside the wall, pressing his ear against the wood. "Do you hear that? It sounds hollow here." Daniel knocked on the boards, and sure enough, a different sound echoed back. Something was hidden inside. They tried prying the boards open with an old rusted crowbar they found in the corner. The wood was stubborn, almost as if it wanted to keep its secrets. Sweat formed on Daniel's brow as he pressed down harder. Finally, with a sharp creak, the board loosened and fell away, revealing a small hollow space behind it. Inside was a wooden box, dusty and sealed with a simple lock. Their hearts raced. Emily held her breath as Daniel lifted the box out, wiping off years of dirt. The lock was rusted but not strong. With a quick twist of the crowbar, it snapped open. Inside, they found old papers, receipts, handwritten notes, and small leather pouches tied with string. Michael untied one pouch and gasped. It was filled with old silver coins, dull but still shining faintly in the lantern light. Emily opened another pouch and found tiny gemstones, rough but colorful. "Dad, what were you doing?" Daniel whispered, half in awe, half in confusion. They spread the contents across the floor, realizing that their father had been quietly collecting valuable things while everyone believed he was wasting money. But this was only the beginning. The journal hinted at something bigger, something far more valuable than coins and stones. Excited, they turned to the next page. This time the writing was more direct. "The true treasure lies beneath. When the river wheel sleeps, the ground remembers." They all looked at each other. Beneath the mill? It was almost too mysterious to believe. Yet the thought filled them with determination. They spent the next few hours exploring the ground floor. Dusty barrels and broken tools lay scattered around, but in one corner they noticed a section of floorboards that seemed newer than the rest. Their color was slightly different, as if they had been replaced not too long before their father's death. Daniel knelt and tapped them with his knuckles. Again that hollow sound. Removing those boards proved harder. The nails were deep and the wood was thick. Michael fetched a hammer and, together with Daniel, They pried the boards up piece by piece. Emily held the lantern closer, her eyes wide with anticipation. Slowly, a dark square opening appeared beneath them, a hidden hatch. Their breaths quickened as Daniel pulled it open. A cold draft of air rushed out, carrying the smell of earth and time. A narrow staircase of stone led downward into the darkness. For a long moment they stood frozen, unsure if they should take the first step. The mill above creaked softly in the wind, almost as if urging them forward. Finally, Emily whispered, "He wanted us to find this. We can't stop now." With lantern in hand, she placed her foot on the first step and began to descend. The staircase was steep, and the air grew colder with each step. The lantern light revealed stone walls damp with moisture, and cobwebs hanging from the ceiling. It felt like stepping back in time. When they finally reached the bottom, they found themselves in a small underground chamber. The walls were lined with shelves, and on those shelves were dozens of wooden crates. The children stared in disbelief. Their father had hidden something much larger than they had ever imagined. Daniel rushed to the nearest crate and tried to pry it open. The old wood splintered easily, and inside they found rows of sealed glass jars filled with old documents. Michael carefully opened one jar and pulled out a folded piece of parchment. His eyes widened as he read the words, "Ownership deeds, stamped and signed decades ago." Land deeds. Emily opened another crate. This one contained rolled-up blueprints, each showing designs for machines and tools she had never seen before. Some had her father's handwriting in the margins, as if he had been studying or improving them. The children exchanged looks of shock. Their father had been far more resourceful than anyone had ever guessed. Suddenly, Emily noticed another box tucked in the corner, smaller than the rest, but secured with an iron clasp. She lifted it carefully and placed it on the ground. With Daniel's crowbar, they forced it open. Inside lay stacks of papers that shimmered faintly in the lantern light. Certificates, bonds, stocks, and more deeds. Michael's hands shook as he held one up. "This is worth a lot of money. Maybe millions." They could hardly believe it. While the town laughed, while everyone accused him of wasting his life, their father had been quietly building a fortune, storing it away in the one place no one would ever look, the old mill. But as overwhelming as the discovery was, it left them with even more questions. Why hadn't their father told them? Why had he let people mock him when he was secretly so wise? What was he planning for them? Emily looked around the chamber, her heart beating fast. "This isn't just about money," she whispered. "He left this for us to find when we were ready. He wanted us to understand his dream." They carried a few of the papers and coins back upstairs, laying them out under the lantern light. The evidence was undeniable. The mill was not worthless. It was a treasure chest carefully hidden in plain sight, and they had only begun to uncover it. That night, back at the house, none of them spoke much during dinner. Each was lost in thought, their minds buzzing with excitement and confusion. Daniel stared at the journal, flipping through more pages. Michael clutched one of the land deeds, still unable to believe it was real. Emily watched the lantern flame flicker, her heart filled with both pride and sorrow. She could almost hear their father's voice saying, "One day you will see." And now they were beginning to see. The following days felt like a dream for Daniel, Michael, and Emily. The hidden chamber beneath the mill had changed everything. What once felt like a burden was now a place of mystery and promise. Each morning they woke up eager to return, lanterns and tools in hand, ready to uncover more of the secrets their father had left behind. The town, however, remained unaware. Neighbors still shook their heads when they saw the siblings walking to the mill. "Still wasting their time," someone muttered at the grocery store. "They'll learn the truth soon enough." If only they knew the truth already sat beneath the mill's floorboards. On the third morning after the discovery, Daniel suggested they take a full day to carefully open each crate. They gathered food and water, prepared lanterns, and descended into the underground chamber once again. The air was cool and damp, but the excitement inside them made the place feel alive. The shelves of crates stood quietly, waiting to be revealed. The first crate they opened that day was filled with small metal boxes, each carefully labeled in their father's handwriting. One read, 1901 bonds. Another read, rare currency. When Michael pried open the box marked bonds, his jaw dropped. Inside were stacks of papers perfectly preserved in plastic sleeves. The dates were old, but the names of the companies were still familiar. Railroads, steelworks, even a few oil companies. These were worth far more than he had imagined. Emily opened the box labeled Rare Currency and found neatly arranged bills from different time periods, some no longer in circulation, but collectors would pay fortunes for them. She held up a bill, its paper crisp despite the years, and whispered, "Dad saved everything. He knew this would be valuable one day." But the most astonishing discovery came when they opened a long, heavy crate at the far end of the chamber. Inside, wrapped in layers of cloth, were pieces of machinery. Strange, intricate gears, metal frames, and odd devices none of them recognized. Alongside them were notebooks filled with sketches. Their father had written notes on improvements to old machines, some ideas looking ahead of their time. Michael flipped through the notebooks with wide eyes. He wasn't just collecting money. He was working on inventions too. Maybe these designs are worth something. Daniel nodded slowly, though his face was serious. "This is more than just a fortune. It's history. These things belong in museums or archives. Dad wanted us to protect them." As they explored deeper, they discovered a smaller side passage branching from the chamber. The stones were rougher here and the space was tighter. Emily squeezed through first, holding her lantern high. Her light revealed another door, this one made of metal and sealed with an old padlock. She called to her brothers, who hurried over. The lock looked rusted but strong. Daniel struck it with the crowbar again and again until finally, with a loud snap, it broke free. The door creaked open and a rush of cold air swept past them. Inside was a smaller room, and in the center of the room sat a large wooden chest, its surface covered in dust and cobwebs. The three of them froze, staring at it as if it might breathe. Emily stepped forward, her hand trembling as she brushed the dust away. Daniel and Michael joined her, and together they lifted the heavy lid. Inside, layered carefully, were more papers, but these were different. They were official ownership documents, stamped and sealed, showing that their father had quietly purchased sections of land surrounding the town. And not just small pieces. Large areas near the river, near forests, and even plots near the main road where businesses had grown over the years. Daniel's eyes widened as he read through them. "Do you realize what this means? Those lands are worth millions today. Some of them have factories on them now. Dad must have leased the land out. He owned more than anyone ever knew." Michael shook his head in disbelief. All those people laughing at him. They had no idea. Emily smiled faintly, tears in her eyes. He didn't care about their laughter. He was building something for us. He kept it hidden because he knew we'd only understand when the time was right. The weight of the discovery pressed on them. Their father had left behind not just a fortune, but a lesson, patience, foresight, and quiet strength. The children sat there for a long time, surrounded by crates of history, treasures of paper and coin, and the proof that their father had never wasted anything. Later that evening, as the sun set outside, they carried a few items back to the house, just enough to study without drawing attention. Daniel spread the documents across the kitchen table, arranging deeds and bonds in neat piles. Michael fetched the journals, eager to cross-reference the sketches with the crates they had opened. Emily sat quietly, holding one of the gemstones, her eyes lost in thought. Finally, Daniel broke the silence. "We need to be careful. If people find out too soon, they'll try to take it from us. We have to secure this first." Michael agreed, though his hands trembled with excitement. "Do you realize how much this is worth? It's not just a little money. This could be 100 million or more." Emily looked at her brothers, her voice soft but firm. "It's not just about the money. It's about Dad. Everyone thought he wasted his life, but he didn't. He left us this not only to make us rich, but to prove he was right. We have to honor that." The next day, they returned to the chamber again. This time, they focused on cataloging what they found. They wrote lists of each crate's contents, photographed the documents with an old camera, and carefully resealed the boxes. They realized they would need experts, lawyers, historians, bankers to properly value and protect these treasures. But for now, the secret belonged to them alone. The mill, once a place of shame and mockery, now felt sacred. Every creak of its beams, every shadow in its corners carried new meaning. Their father had built more than a building. He had built a legacy hidden in plain sight. As night fell, the children sat outside on the porch, listening to the river flow beside the mill. The stars above were bright and the air was cool. Emily spoke softly, almost as if she were speaking to the wind. "Dad, we found it. We understand now. You didn't waste anything. The brothers nodded, each silently promising to protect what they had uncovered. None of them knew yet how the world would react when the truth came out. But one thing was certain. Their lives, and the reputation of their father, would never be the same again. The day the truth began to spread came sooner than the children had expected. For weeks, Daniel, Michael, and Emily had been carefully uncovering more of the crates, reading through deeds, sorting through coins, and documenting every single piece of their father's hidden fortune. They tried to keep everything secret, but secrets have a way of slipping through even the smallest cracks. One evening, while they were carrying a crate of documents back to the house, an old neighbor spotted them. He noticed the way Daniel guarded the box, the way Emily held the lantern high with care, and the way Michael walked protectively beside them. The neighbor didn't say anything at first, but by the next morning, whispers had begun to swirl through town. At first, the rumors were small. "The Thomas kids are still playing in that broken mill," some said with a chuckle. "Maybe they found their dad's old hammer and think it's gold." But as days went by, more people noticed unusual activity. A few townsfolk saw the siblings visiting the notary office. Others spotted them talking quietly with a lawyer from the nearby city. The whispers grew louder. Curiosity began to mix with suspicion. Finally, the children realized they could no longer keep everything hidden. If they tried to deny it, people would only grow more determined to pry. So, one bright afternoon, Daniel suggested they take the step their father must have known would come, revealing the truth. They invited a lawyer and an appraiser to the mill. The experts walked carefully into the underground chamber, their lanterns casting long shadows against the stone walls. The lawyer adjusted his glasses, his mouth falling open as he read through the deeds and certificates. The appraiser's hands trembled as he examined the coins, the gemstones, and the bonds. "Do you understand what you're sitting on?" the appraiser asked in disbelief. "This isn't just valuable. This is historic. This collection is worth tens of millions. With the land deeds included, it could easily exceed 100 million. Daniel, Michael, and Emily exchanged stunned glances, even though they had already suspected it. Hearing it spoken aloud made the weight of the discovery even heavier. Emily's heart swelled with pride, not just for the fortune, but for the truth that was finally shining through. Their father had not been a fool. He had been a visionary, but outside the mill the world was changing fast. News traveled through the small town like wildfire. The once mocking voices now turned into hushed conversations filled with awe and envy. "Did you hear? Old Thomas's mill wasn't worthless after all. The kids found something down there, something huge. They say it's a fortune. 100 million! People who had laughed at their father now shook their heads in shame. Shopkeepers who once called him foolish now told customers, "I always said he was a smart man." Old neighbors came knocking on the children's door, offering congratulations while secretly hoping for a share of the discovery. Some even tried to claim they had been close friends with Thomas, though the children remembered clearly how those same people had mocked him years before. The local newspaper picked up the story. A headline appeared: "Old Mill hides fortune. Thomas children uncover $100 million legacy." Soon, reporters from larger towns began to arrive, carrying notebooks and cameras. They crowded around the mill, snapping photos of the weathered walls, asking endless questions. "How did you find it? Did your father ever tell you about it? What will you do with the money?" The children answered carefully, always giving credit to their father. Daniel said, "Our father believed in the mill even when no one else did. He always said everything had a reason. Now we finally understand what he meant." Emily added softly, "He didn't waste anything. He left us a gift, not just of money, but of faith and vision." Despite the growing attention, the children remained protective of the mill. They didn't allow anyone else into the underground chamber, not even the reporters. They knew their father had trusted only them to carry on his dream. Instead, they chose to reveal only enough to prove the truth: a few coins, some documents, and the appraisal report. That alone was enough to silence the laughter forever. The townsfolk, once scornful, began to change their tune. The same grocery store owner who had mocked Thomas now said proudly, "That man was a genius. I always knew there was something special about him." Others tried to excuse themselves by saying, "We didn't understand his ways, but he must have been planning this all along." The children listened politely, but in their hearts they remembered the years of ridicule. They knew who had truly stood by their father and who had not. Amid all this, the children decided to honor their father properly. Instead of selling the mill for quick money, they began making plans to restore it. They hired craftsmen to strengthen the beams, repair the roof, and clean the walls. Slowly, the old mill transformed. The water wheel was repaired and began turning again, its creak now a proud sound instead of a broken one. Fresh paint covered the faded boards and flowers grew around its base. Soon, the mill became more than just a family treasure. It became a landmark. Visitors arrived not just to see the fortune, but to witness the place where a man had quietly built a legacy while the world mocked him. The children set aside one section of the building as a small museum. Inside, they displayed some of the coins, a few of the journals, and copies of the deeds. A plaque on the wall read, "In honor of Thomas, who saw value where others saw none." The restoration brought new life to the town as well. Tourists who came to see the mill bought food, stayed in local inns, and shopped in local stores. The economy, once stagnant, began to grow, and in the hearts of the townspeople, respect replaced ridicule. Yet for the children, the most important part wasn't the money or the fame. It was the change in how people spoke about their father. No longer was he called the man who wasted everything. Now he was remembered as a man who had vision, patience, and faith in his work. His name carried honor, not mockery. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting golden light across the newly restored mill, the siblings stood together watching the wheel turn slowly in the river. Emily whispered, "Can you hear it? It's like the mill is alive again." Dad would have loved this. Daniel placed his arm around her shoulder and nodded. He'd be proud. Not just because we found the fortune, but because we proved him right, Michael added with a smile. He never wanted to be rich for himself. He wanted to build something that lasted. And now, because of him, we can. As the lanterns inside the mill glowed warmly that night, the children felt a deep peace settle over them. The world finally saw what they had always suspected in their hearts. Their father had never wasted anything. He had given them a legacy that would live on, not just in wealth, but in respect, honor, and love. And while the town marveled at the fortune, the children knew the real treasure was the man who had believed when no one else did. The weeks turned into months, and the mill that once stood in silence now breathed with new life. What was once mocked as a useless ruin had become the pride of the town. The wooden beams were repaired, the roof stood strong, and the water wheel turned steadily with the flowing river. But even more than the building itself, it was the story of the mill that drew people from far and wide. Travelers came to see the place where a man's vision had been hidden in plain sight, where a fortune had been uncovered by children who refused to let go of their father's dream. For Daniel, Michael, and Emily, life had changed completely. Their days were now filled with meetings with historians, bankers, and museum curators. Every week, new offers came from collectors who wanted to buy some of the coins or documents. Some offered millions for a single item, but the siblings chose carefully. They sold only enough to secure their future and maintain the mill. The rest they kept safe exactly as their father had intended. Still, no matter how much money was involved, the children never lost sight of what truly mattered. Their father's name was no longer spoken with ridicule. Instead, people now talked about him with respect. "Thomas was a man ahead of his time," said one reporter. "He saw value where others saw none." That sentence appeared in newspapers across the state. Emily, the youngest, spent her evenings walking through the restored mill, her fingers brushing against the smooth wooden walls. She often paused by the small plaque they had hung in the entrance. "In honor of Thomas, who saw value where others saw none." Whenever she read those words, tears filled her eyes, but they were tears of pride. She could almost hear her father's gentle voice saying, "Everything we do here has a reason." Daniel, the eldest, took on the role of protector. He oversaw the financial side, making sure the land deeds were secure, the documents were preserved, and the treasures cataloged. He had always been the most skeptical of their father's dream, but now he carried the deepest respect. He often said, "Dad saw further than I ever could. I'll make sure no one ever takes this away again." Michael became the bridge between the past and the future. He worked with architects and engineers to expand the mill into a cultural site. One section was turned into a small museum where visitors could see some of the rare currency and gemstones. Another section became a learning center, where children from the town came to hear stories about vision, patience, and belief. Michael believed their father wanted the mill not just for them, but for everyone. The townspeople, once quick to mock, now came with open hearts. School groups toured the museum, families visited on weekends, and older residents who had once laughed at Thomas now bowed their heads in quiet respect as they read about his hidden fortune. The laughter of mockery had been replaced by the laughter of joy. The mill was no longer a symbol of failure. It was a monument of triumph. One summer afternoon, the siblings organized a community gathering at the mill. Lanterns were hung across the beams, tables were set with food, and the sound of music filled the air. People from the town came together, not just to celebrate the fortune, but to honor the man who had once been misunderstood. Standing on the steps of the mill, Daniel gave a short speech. His voice was steady, filled with emotion. "Our father spent his life here in this very building," he said. "He was mocked, laughed at, and called a fool. But he never gave up. He believed in something greater. Today, because of his vision, we stand not just as his children, but as his legacy. This mill belongs to all of us. As a reminder that what seems worthless may hold unimaginable value if we only have the patience to see it." Applause echoed across the yard, and many had tears in their eyes. Emily stepped forward and added softly, "He didn't waste anything. He gave us everything." From that day, the mill became more than a building. It became a lesson. People traveled miles to see it, not just to admire the wealth, but to carry home the message that dreams should never be dismissed simply because others cannot see them. Parents brought their children and said, "Remember this story. Remember that sometimes the greatest treasures are hidden in the places people ignore." For the siblings, their lives found new meaning. They no longer felt the sting of shame when passing through town. Instead, they felt pride. Strangers approached them to shake their hands, thanking them for sharing their father's legacy. Offers for interviews, books, and even films arrived, but they accepted only what honored their father's memory. Fame meant little to them. Respect meant everything. Late one evening, as the sky turned dark and stars lit the night, the three of them sat on the porch of their old house, looking at the glowing mill across the river. Fireflies danced in the warm air, and the steady sound of the water wheel turning filled the silence. For a long time, none of them spoke. Then Michael said, "Do you realize we've not just inherited money, but an entire story? Dad gave us more than treasure. He gave us hope." Daniel nodded, his gaze fixed on the mill. "He was building for us long before we understood. He let people laugh because he knew one day we'd see, and now the world sees too." Emily rested her head against her brother's shoulder and whispered, "It feels like he's still here, watching over us. The mill is his voice still speaking." That night, as the lanterns inside the mill flickered softly, the siblings felt at peace. The journey had been difficult, filled with doubt and struggle, but the truth had triumphed. Their father's name had been restored, his vision celebrated, and his children had carried his dream into the future. Years later, long after the first wave of excitement had passed, the mill still stood strong, its wheel turning with the river. Children of the town grew up hearing the story of the man who had been mocked, but had left behind a fortune greater than anyone imagined. And each time a visitor entered the museum, they paused at the plaque that told his story, feeling a spark of inspiration. For Daniel, Michael, and Emily, the lesson never faded. They knew wealth could be measured in coins and deeds, but the true fortune was the love of a father who had believed in them even when they doubted themselves. That love, quiet and patient, was the treasure worth more than 100 million. And so, as the sun rose each morning over the river, shining its golden light on the mill, it was clear to everyone who saw it, Thomas had not wasted anything. He had built a legacy that would live forever.